Hey guys, Kevin Cleary with a knife video for you. I got a pretty cool blade today. This one is one that has a bit of a history behind it. So I've got the Liong Mah Design Remedy. This is built by Reate knives, and I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, but that's what we're going with. I'll tell you, the way I came about getting this knife was kind of a process. So I've been interested in Reate, and I've been seeing what they've done, and I've heard all these great things. And so I'm like, yeah, I'd like to pick one up and just, check it out. And I just wasn't that wild about their designs. I really wasn't. So when they started collaborating with different designers, I was like, hey, this could be a great thing, because I'm not that into their current designs. And this is about the time like the Horizon C was coming out, that I still wasn't. I'd seen the District 9 and followed it through the A and B, and now the C and the Hills, and I was just like, they're okay, but there's nothing special there. Now I will say I'm a little more interested in their most recent release, and I just can't think of the name of it. If you can think of that, go ahead and comment below with that most recent Reate, the one with the Todd bag ceramic ball clip. That one I am interested in. I may try to get my hands on one. Now, getting back to the knife we're talking about, it took a little while. When the Warrior 1 came out, I was like, cool knife, but I'm not that crazy about it. And then they did one other one before this. And so finally, the Remedy. And when I saw the Remedy, I was like, hey, that's a knife I'm really interested in. And so eventually, I was able to get my hands on one. I think there is one even more newer model than this from Liong Mah that looks pretty cool as well. Now, let's get back to specifically what we're talking about with this knife, but that gives you kind of the background and why, I've been interested for a while, and I've been watching what Reate Knives was doing and what Liong Mah was doing with them and other collabs as well, and finally found one that I really was interested in, and so I was able to pick this one up. Now, when you buy these knives, they do come with a little case, which is kind of a nice touch, okay? Certainly a better offering than just stick it in a box with some styrofoam and shoot it off. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that, but it just adds a little touch of class to the whole thing, all right? So this knife, for size and weight, it is 8 3/8 inches overall, 4 3/4 inch handle, 3 5/8 inch blade, and it weighs in at 5.4 ounces. So for everyday carry, this is actually really nice. I will say, when you are carrying it, you don't really notice it in your pocket. It's fairly small at under 5 inches. The roundness makes it go in and out of pocket nicely. The pocket clip is a little stiff, but it's not the end of the world at all, and you can get it in and out of your pocket fairly easily with one hand. And that's, I have knives that you need two hands to struggle with on your pocket, so if you can get it in and out with one hand, that's pretty good. Now, I will say, this is a knife that it comes in at a pretty high price point. But for that price point, I think this knife is up to the task, okay? I don't think, let's put it this way. I don't think you're going to get this and say, yeah, it's not good enough for what they're charging. It's every bit as good as other knives that are as much and even much, much more, okay? So, before we get into other specific stuff about this, like the blade and the lockup and all that, let's do a couple comparisons. The first one is really just for the name. This is the CRKT Eraser, and it's designed by Liong Mah. And guys, I gotta tell you, I love the blade on this knife. It is just absolutely gorgeous. But this is another knife from the same designer, all right? And I do really like this knife, and this was kind of the knife that made me a fan of Liong Mah. Now, I want to share with you some other designs that are more similar and that maybe you're familiar with, so that you can get a sense for the size on this. So there's a Boker Quaken, much heavier, by the way, but you can see they're pretty similar in terms of size, okay? Now, the Quaken is quite a bit heavier. Another knife that's at a similar size is the Ferrum Forge Ferex, and I would compare these two in terms of quality, although they're very different. I'm actually going to make a comparison video between these two, because it's, on paper, they're very, very similar, but then when you get them in hand, they could not be more different. So it's this weird sort of, how can two knives that have all of the same features, or many of the same features, end up being so different in reality? Another knife, now this is another Thai frame lock, and again, a great flipper. and of course flipper only, which has kind of been the theme up to this point. This is the Boker Federal, which is a GTC collab. Again, not all that similar, but very familiar. So because a lot of people know about this knife, I thought it'd make a good size comparison. One other, and I've got another knife here that I'll talk about when I get to grip, but when you're thinking of size on this, the 0562 is again very similar. Now I'll talk about this again when lockup and deployment comes up. But for now, those are the other knives that, number one, if you're interested in this, you may be interested in some of those, but also if you're familiar with those, then you kind of know what you're getting in terms of size and weight with this knife, okay? So a lot of similar knives there that are, some of them are quite high-end carry, some of them not so much. Obviously, the CRKT is not what I would consider a high-end carry, but it is a Liong Mah Design. So let's get back to the knife in question, and I'll zoom in a little bit so you can kind of see what I'm talking about while we talk about the blade and some of the other features. That is, if my camera will listen. There we go. Okay, so the blade on this is S35VN steel, which a lot of Reate knives are. It's actually a drop point blade, or maybe even a modified clip point, although essentially it's what you would call like a standard blade. That is, a standard blade would be just a perfectly straight spine, perfectly straight, and it just comes up to meet at the end like what you see on the Quaken, okay? But this one is slightly different in that there is kind of a crest here and it is kind of clipped off here. So maybe you call it a modified clip point. So what's cool about this knife is it's essentially a Quaken design with just some slight tweaks. So instead of just a standard blade shape, there's a clip point. Instead of a standard squared off handle, there's a finger choil and some rounding and some angling that takes place. And I think it's close enough to a Quaken that it still carries that traditional sort of look and feel to it, but it's different enough. It's just modernized enough that it makes it interesting and compelling. So back to the blade, there is this top swedge here, and the top swedge is nice except for one thing. I wish they would have started it just a little further up so that when you have your thumb up here, there's a little more blade stock to rest your thumb on. Okay, it's not the end of the world, but it would just, and the jimping here is good, by the way. It would have been nice to have just a little more real estate right there for your thumb. And that's on the back of the spine there where, you know, they've started this swedge. Now in terms of looks, the swedge does make good sense, and it allows for a very nice flow between the handle and the blade, where this line is just continued on. And this same line here is picked up in, sorry, I gotta switch sides, is picked up in the pocket clip as well, which is a really nice, I know we're talking about aesthetics at this point instead of the blade, but I'll get right back to the blade here in a second. So back to the blade, S35VN stonewash finish on this blade, and it's a very well done stonewash. Although let me just say, I think this knife would actually look a little prettier if you went with a satin finish on the primary bevel. Okay, on the primary grind here, I think it would actually be cool to see a satin finish there, and then some point on the handle you'd have to kind of accent that. So whether you did it on the clip or whether you did it on these flats, or somehow you'd want to pick up a little bit more satin, and it would kind of match with the hardware. Okay, now I'll talk about this a little further at the end. I want to have a little discussion about sort of mid-tech knives and the ability to sort of pimp them out a little. Now, blade is nice and thin behind the edge, so it slices extremely well. It's a rather utilitarian blade shape. You know, there's nothing, you know, there's no recurve, there's no crazy wild lines here. It's just a very traditional blade shape, but with that, you know, there's a reason that it's a tradition, that tradition arose. It's just a very practical, functional blade shape, and as an EDC, this functions really, really well. The flat grind is high enough that essentially this is going to function like, you know, your typical Spyderco with like a high flat grind. All right, so grind is good, shape is good. I like the look of the swedge. Everything is very well finished. The feel of this is really cool. One of the things that stands out about this knife overall is wherever you touch it with your hands, it just feels very well finished. It feels very comfortable, sort of almost has a soft feel to it, which I know seems strange for titanium and steel, but it just feels soft. That's the best way I can think of to explain it. So, very good blade steel. S35VN is, you know, kind of a step above even S30V. I find it's very, very nice to sharpen. Now, this knife, I will say, came to me dull. So either it was dull because of very light use, and if there was some light use on it, it was very light because this thing came like literally like brand new. There's not a single flaw in this knife anywhere. So I did give it a light sharpening just on a fairly high grit stone. It didn't need a lot, just a very light touch up and a strop, and then it was good to go. And it's held that edge ever since. And I have put some use on this knife since I've had it. I don't abuse it or anything like that, but I have used it and it does perform exceptionally well. And that edge, I have stropped it a couple times, but it has held up really, really well, which is basically expected from S35VN. So that's the blade. What about lockup and deployment? I will zoom out a little bit for this just because it's hard to see when I start moving the knife around, but it is a flipper only, and the flipper is very, very good, okay? The detent is pretty strong, and I want to just, you know, if you're familiar with some of ZT's stuff, the 0562 or the 0454, which I found the detent was stronger on that than this. 0560 is kind of known to have a strong detent. Now it's interesting in the progression that takes place. When this knife came out, there were complaints about the detent. It's strong enough, but I will say, for comparison's sake, if you've got a 0560, if you've got other zero tolerance knives, the detent on this is just a little stronger, okay? Now, where it kind of balances that out is where you see how this kind of hook shape digs into your finger a little bit. Because this is flat, it is actually more comfortable. So yes, it takes a little more force to push this out. And if you light switch it, you could do this all day and not get a lot of wear and tear on your fingers. If you push button it, you're kind of pushing on the sharpened corner there, and it's not sharpened, but it's a little sharper than the flat. So if you push button it all the time, it still works very well and maybe increases speed a little bit, but it will get more uncomfortable because you're pushing right on the corner of that flipper tab. Okay, if you light switch it, you're kind of pushing on the flat portion, and it's very comfortable and not too abrasive at all. So that's where the detent lands on this. It's a pretty firm detent, and it really doesn't necessarily need to be, because I want you to see that when we talk about deployment, this is very, very smooth. It is a ball bearing pivot, and it's an extremely well done ball bearing pivot. It is just extremely smooth feeling, extremely high quality feeling. It puts me in mind of the Garza, and I think I've commented before, but the Garza and the Southern Talc are the two knives that I own that are about the smoothest I've experienced, and this is right up there with them, okay? So extremely, extremely smooth action on this knife. Really, really feels great. It does have that large decorative pivot, which I actually think is a nice touch. Now, one thing that's cool about this is you could, if you made some minor modifications, you know, you could anodize that pivot or do different things to it, and it would look really sharp. The design is kind of a minimalist design. You see there's not a lot going on here, and the stonewash hides a little bit of what is going on, okay? So we'll come back to that in a second, but I'm just gonna sort of put that out there for you to kind of notice as I'm talking. So what else do we need to know about the lock? Well, it's very comfortable, and that's always a thing. If you're a knife like this, guys, it's one of those knives that's made for, you know, people like myself and maybe you if you're watching this video that probably flick their knives open a little too often. You know, when I'm watching TV or I'm working on the computer or watching a video or reading a book or something like that, I'll often have a knife and I'll be flipping it. So the comfort and the ease of use on the flipper tab and on the lock are rather important to me, even though they probably shouldn't be. You know, it's almost an unfair criticism to say, oh, this lock is hard to disengage. Well, it's a lock. It probably shouldn't be that easy to disengage. And this one's not too easy, but it's easy enough that you can go ahead and do this all day and not you know, tear the skin off your thumb from unlocking this knife over and over again. So it's comfortable, it's easy, it's fast, it's smooth. All these are kinds of things that we look for in lockup and deployment. It is very, very solid. A knife of this caliber, you would not expect to see any issues, although there have been times when expensive knives did have problems. One of the things I've got to say about this, there's two things I want to point out here before we move on. Number one is the lock bar insert. And the only thing that gives the lock bar insert away is the screw here. And I haven't seen this yet, but I'm sure it's out there. Maybe you can inform me in the comments below. It'd be cool if they put the screw on the inside actually. And this was totally invisible, but it is a very, you know, fairly well hidden lock bar insert. You can see it here. If I turn the knife this way, there's a little piece of hardened stainless steel in there. And it does extend back behind the rest of the frame here to serve as an over travel stop as well. The other thing I want to say is because of the location of the blade tang and the detent ball, unlike this knife, okay, watch what happens when I unlock this knife. Okay, it's all the way here. The detent ball interferes right at that point with, and all it's doing is the detent ball is catching on the top of the frame lock, okay? Here, the detent ball does not interfere with the top of the frame lock, with the top of the lock bar that way. I guess it does all the way back here, but because they're so close, okay, I've already, by the time, see, I naturally fold the knife to about there, which is past where the detent ball would interfere. So it feels much smoother. There's not that little bump that you get on a lot of frame locks. I've got so many knives that, you know, in the last couple of years, there's been a bit of a change where now you seem to always feel that detent ball interfere with the lock bar just at about this point in the closing, okay? Not so on this knife, which makes it feel very, very smooth. The other detail I want to point out is the hidden stop pin. So it's really, really cool. Essentially, there's like a milled channel in this titanium at the top, and let's see if I can, there we go. There you go. So you can see right there, there's the stop pin. But notice when it's closed, it's hidden. And when it's open, it's also hidden. Now, one question I do have, and I don't know the answer, I'm just purely asking the question, and maybe if somebody from Reate or if Liong Mah, you ever watch this, go ahead and comment on this. What stopped you from just having this totally closed off? Okay, so you can see how there's like this opening in the top. I don't know why you couldn't just mill out the lines inside and do nothing more. And now the stop pin would be completely invisible. You'd never actually see it. All right, not the end of the world. It's still a cool knife. It's still, you know, I really like everything about it. It's just a question that I have. What was the deciding factor that made this little piece here at the top be cut out? The other thing that's cool is to notice how, like on the Southern and a few other really good quality knives, everything just sort of flows and matches when the knife is in the closed position. I think that's you know, just shows an attention to detail that I think is important. So that's lockup and deployment. Let's move on to the handle, and the handle is one of those features that I really want to tell you about. This knife just melts into your hand. It feels so comfortable, and I think it's a combination of things. It's a combination of the very nicely rounded corners, the kind of step down. You've got a choil and then a step, so your hand, just your fingers nicely fit here. There's a very slight angle at the back, and so all of these things sort of come together, combined with the 3D machining on the titanium scales, and so all of those things come together to make this an extremely ergonomic knife. Very, very, very comfortable. Okay, now if I do have a complaint, and it's not really a complaint, this handle just is big enough for me, okay? So if you're a guy with a really, really huge hand, you may say, yeah, this knife is kind of too small. This may end up, let's say your hand was really big, you could end up with this handle in here like that. Probably wouldn't be the end of the world, but it wouldn't be sort of a full hand grip for you, okay? Now, what I want to say about the finish, and I think I may have to zoom in here for just a second to show you what I'm talking about, is that there are these milling lines left on the titanium. Let's see. Should be able to see them pretty well there now. I think I'm in focus. There we go. So you can see these very light lines going across the knife. And those are actually from the milling process, okay? So it's not like they've done an extra step to put those lines on. In fact, they maybe skipped a step by not removing them. But they do add, they look really, really sharp, okay? I really like the way they look. And even more, I really like the way they feel in hand. So it's one of those things where, you know, if you're a knife maker, maybe you could skip the step of taking these milling lines off, and they're left from, you know, that CNC as it goes back and forth and cuts the shape of this handle out. It does it in stages, right? So you can imagine a bit going over and over and over and over and over and over this, and it leaves just a very slight line. They're hard to feel, and if you closed your eyes, you wouldn't say, oh yeah, there's lines on this. It's only when you look at it, you can see the lines. But when you feel it in hand, it just feels a little different than something like this. This is the Ferox that's just plain flat titanium, okay? So when you feel these two knives, there's an extremely distinct difference in the feel. This one almost feels like it has, as I said before, a soft finish, which I don't know why that term is the best term I can come up with to describe it, but that's how it feels. It just feels soft, okay? Almost, and it does give you, definitely gives you a little more grip when you really hold on to this tightly. So those milling lines, although I understand that they didn't do anything extra to add them, it's still a really nice touch that they left them on. Let's finally get to the 3D machined clip, and this is about the only thing that I can say negative about this. The clip works fine, okay, so it's not that it doesn't function. It's a little stiff, it's a little tight, but that's completely acceptable. What I think is odd about it is the location. You can see how it's very high up. It just, honestly, I don't know where else you could have put it, but it just feels like it's not in the best spot. And I can't explain any further than that. Maybe you could have made it a little longer and moved it down a bit and put it about where, you know, attached it here, about where the lanyard hole is. Maybe that influences the way it feels. So what I will say about this is in the location that it's in, it sort of tucks into the top of your hand here, and it's very comfortable. This is one of the most comfortable knives I've felt in a long time. So I'm not suggesting to move it, because maybe if you did move it, I wouldn't be saying it's as comfortable as it is, but it just seems to look a little odd. Now, maybe that could be remedied if, and this is, now that I'm kind of all done everything, I'll back out. Hold on, a little further. There we go. And give you my overall impressions. If you've been watching this video all along, you know I'm pretty impressed with this knife. You know, the action is very fast, very smooth. The blade feels great in hand. I love the way the milling lines look. I love the decorative pivot. There's just a lot of things I really, really like about this knife. What I would say finally is, you know, and by the way, I think it's a great size for EDC. Price point, yeah, is a little steep, but if you compare this to other, you know, when the 560 came out, these things were selling for like 300 bucks, 275, and so 350 for this is probably not the end of the world. It is right up there in like Hinderer Sebenza territory, not quite to that level, but I've got to tell you, in terms of quality, in terms of fit and finish, in terms of performance, it's right there, okay? There's nothing that I would take away from this knife and say, oh, buy this other one, because I can't really give you anything that would be a determining factor. Now, obviously, if you're more interested in certain features of a Hinderer or a Sebenza or some other, you know, at that price point now, there's all kinds of knives, that's fine. But I've got to say this, if you like the features, you're not going to be disappointed with this knife. It is phenomenal. Very, very well done. So that's my overall impression. I'm just super impressed. I really love this knife. I have a hard time taking it out of my pocket for any reason. It's just really, really outstanding. Okay. Now, the last thing I want to say, and if you're still watching, good on you. this is a knife that I can really see sending to a knife pimper like, you know, all of a sudden I can't think of any. There's a good guy here in Canada. I've seen some of his work on Blade Forums. He does phenomenal work. But also there's like Solo Knife Reviews and Johnson Knives. That's the one I was trying to think of a second ago. I would really like to send this to a knife pimper and get something done to it. Now, what I'd like to hear from you is, what do you think I should do with it? And I'm not saying I'll necessarily do this. I'll be honest, because I have a number of other knives in my collection, I generally don't modify heavily one knife in particular, because, you know what I mean? It's not that, if it was the only knife I owned and it was just my pride and joy and I carried it every day, then I would be more inclined, I think, to mod it. But I'm not promising that I'll do it, but I would love to hear your ideas. I could see this with a two-tone finish, you know, one color anodized here, one color on these cutouts, and maybe, or maybe do like a polished finish here on this cutout portion of the titanium that matched with a polished finish here, and a little bit of polishing on the pocket clip, just sort of tie everything together. I don't know, there's lots of options, and that's one of the things that we don't often talk about, is these sort of higher end mid-tech style knives that are sort of stonewashed titanium. They do lend themselves to modifying after the fact. So that would be kind of a cool discussion to have, is what do you think would look cool done to this knife? There you go, guys. That's my take on the Liong Mah Remedy. Thanks for sticking with me this long. This is certainly a longer video, but I wanted to touch on every detail of this knife. We'll talk to you soon.